Good evening, everybody. We will start now. I welcome you to the CILE panel, the public lecture for this evening. The title of the public lecture is Ethical Dilemmas in Current Migration and Refugee Experiences from Muslim Perspective. By way of introduction, universally speaking, human migration really has shaped and transformed the history of humankind. Individuals and groups have migrated for many reasons: economic, religious, political, as well as for education and cultural exchange. Masses of people have also migrated to escape conflict, persecution, natural disasters, and harsh living conditions. Migration has also shaped the history of Islam from its very beginnings. In today's world, the large majority of migrants and asylum seekers is a Muslim phenomenon. In this public lecture, our panel of speakers will address contemporary ethical problems concerning migrants and refugees. For example, how is the nation-state affected by the intake of asylum seekers, refugees and/or economic labour migrants, so-called? And how does this affect the implementation of Islamic ethical principles regarding human equality, where only citizens belonging to the nation-state can enjoy full rights? Further, how can the higher objectives of Sharia, the maqasid, be implemented in relation to refugees and migrants? Are the obligations at the level of the nation state, or are they only the responsibilities at the individual level or communities? The panelists in this public lecture are participants in a 3-day CILE seminar on migration issues, and they've kindly agreed to present at this public forum. I will introduce the panelists: Dr. Abdul Majid Khan, whose presentation title is Integrating Migrant Rights with Host Rights and Migrant Duties. I will give you a brief bio before each presenter. Dr. Abbas Barzegar, on my right, the living fiqh of Muslim humanitarianism. Dina Taha will talk on Syrian refugee brides, sisters, victims, or agents. And last but not least, Dr. Taha Zaman will be giving a presentation called Mapping Togetherness, Rescaling the Ummah. Okay, so let me first introduce our first speaker, Dr. Abdul Majid Khan. He is Associate Professor at the Department of Islamic Studies at Aligarh Muslim University in India. He obtained his MA in Islamic Studies in 1993 and an MPhil in 1999 at Kashmir University and a PhD in 2005 at Aligarh Muslim University. His PhD thesis was published as Contemporary Islamic Response to the Western Impact, a case study of the Muslim Institute of London. Fluent in English, Urdu, Arabic, Kashmiri and Persian, and with some knowledge of Turkish, Dr. Khan is a member of several national and international academic bodies and has published articles on culture, mysticism, human rights, environment, globalization and consumerism. Please, Dr. Khan, take it away.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi wahdah wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'dah. This is an honor for me to address the gathering on a very important subject. From an Islamic point of view, to adopt an ethical course is not a choice. This is an integral part of the faith. Given the viewpoint of Islam, man has been sent to this world just to test him. He will be having different conditions. The one who possesses, he is tested. The man who is dispossessed, he too is tested. So how we make the opportunities which are with us to fulfill our mission. This is the purpose of human life. And the whole time period of one's life, one is to get engaged in activities, have a viewpoint about life, a worldview which is in consonance with the scheme of God. And from Islamic point of view, everybody is accountable for what he believed in, what was his worldview, what he did during his lifetime. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has assured those who just adopt a proper way of thinking and doing with the eternal bliss, Jannah. So it's not a choice. We know that in Islam there are certain very important principles or directives or commands which one has to do and achieve the objectives what is commanded in Quran. And Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who has been uswa hasana, Allah has called about his life, so that is to be followed. Now if we see, one of the basic principles of Islam is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, "Takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah," that you develop in you the akhlaq of Allah. MashaAllah, we say about Allah, He is Rahman and Rahim, compassion, mercifulness. This is something we often talk of. So what is expected of a person, whoever he is, that he should develop this. And I am reminded here of one of the events from the life of Hazrat Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who is the second Khalifa, that once he was along with a caravan and he stopped at a place and asked the whole caravan to wait for him. He was the Khalifa at that time. Large chunks of the land were under his control and command. And he told the people, "Do you know what is this place? This is the place my father used to give me the task to tend the camels. And he would then come and beat me with a stick and telling me that you are not able to do it properly." So he reminded, while he was in the position of possession and command, he reminded himself that he too is a common man and he has to be conscious of it. So this has very two important dimensions. One is vertical dimension, another is horizontal dimension. That if you want to purify yourself, you can do it by having a proper attitude to Allah's beings. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said, "Al-khalqu kulluhum ayalullah." The whole creation is Allah's family. So how you want to be to His family? Those of you who are good to His family, Allah will love them. And so when your life objective is to please God, to get His ridha, how you should look at different people and different situations. Now coming to the topic of the current situation, we know that the whole world is reeling under materialism, when material prosperity is the be-all and end-all of human activity. And it has generated a society where large number of people get dispossessed. There are migrations because of persecutions. So the people those who are in a better position, it is their moral responsibility, because they all ayalullah, they are Allah's family. How you should treat them, how you should open up your heart and just treat them well. Then treating well others and without qualifying and quantifying is a problem. So I will just tell you what is expected of a person who wants to excel in morality. It is that you treat what you wish for yourself, wish the same for your brother. So the notion of equality, the notion of equal human dignity for others, what you want for yourself, let you want same thing for your brother. So these basic moral injections, if the faith community, those who believe in Islam, whether they are in position of giving shelter to the people or they're engaging the migrant laborers, it is their responsibility and duty to be not only just, to be compassionate to others. Then this is very important, that in Islam there is no right without responsibility. Rights and responsibilities are interconnected. Allah has given us a right that we choose. If we don't choose properly, we say there is hell. So this responsibility one cannot shun. We cannot abjure the responsibilities which come with our wujud. When we live, we have conscience, we possess something, we don't possess anything. We have a responsibility to give a proper response to it. So the people who are the migrants, who are asylum seekers, I hear every day, we listen to different stories, heart-rending stories, and we have to be very sensitive to the situations. Mostly people, they are not the creation of the people who are affected. This is the creation largely of the powers who are playing globally for their own aggrandizement, for their own positions, and the people are victims of it. So to develop a sensitivity, this is minimum. First, to develop a sensitivity towards the problems of others. Believe me, for me personally, I tell you, I am unable to even watch what is there going on around the globe. If I see small clip, I just close it down. I say, no, it's not possible. If I am unable to do anything, why it may just decrease my sensitivities to the sufferings of the people. But those who can do something about it, though speaking globally, we should be part of the effort where the system of materialism is changed by a system where man regains his true position of Khalifa al-Ard, where he regains his religious consciousness, where he wants that Allah's creation should get their due. There should not be those who exploit others. There should not be those who are at the receiving end to the level. You see that in a common society, when we are economical, we are in the economic struggle. Some people are mahroom, some people get, some people are dispossessed. But Islam tells us, take care of those who are lis-CILE wal mahroom, who are dispossessed for any reason. Now when the system is like that, global system is, we are operating in a capitalistic and neo-colonial phase of history. Globally, we should be part of that system where we can have a better worldview, where our material needs and our material wants are moderated by higher ethical considerations. On one side, on second side, whatever is possible to address the issues that humans regain their autonomy wherever they are, they get their dignity, they get the treatment which they deserve as Allah's ayal. And they have, this is very important for all of us, the first thing is that we have to just keep in mind that there are many people, many organizations around the globe, that the people are in such need that they lose that we have what is our religion, what is our culture. So they are trading, they are helping them with small things and getting their Iman and Islam out of them. So this is the responsibility of the religious communities to allow people to retain their own religious affiliations, and they must have their cultural and religious autonomies. Then for Islam, another Islamic principle is La yashkurullah man la yashkurun nas. We must be thankful. While it is al yadul ulya khairun min yadis sufla. Okay, you are givers, your position is that is, let everybody try. Let me be a giver. Let me be a giver. But if you are not, I just remember one of the very important events in the Hijrah, when there was the Hijrah from Mecca to Medina, Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam companions, after Muakhat was there, their brotherhood was established by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what was the attitude of the Muhajirun? After some days, they said to their Ansar brother, thank you very much for offering me this much. Please lead me to a market. I am actually, I know trade, so that I am not dependent on what you offer me. That is very important for those that who come as asylum seekers, who come as migrants, that any condition does not make them that they should be insensitive. Their moral responsibility does not stop. They must not only go for the rights, they must also show gratitude to the people who help them and be very sincerely attached to the society which gives them succor. So this is very important on behalf of those people, because in Islam, your moral responsibility is never suspended. You are always you may be under strain, under stress. I told you conditions are very, very serious, but your moral responsibility is never suspended. You have to always be careful about the rights, and you cannot earn the respect of others only by just demanding the rights. You have to show the gratitude and your concern for the society which you want to integrate to. And I just see that there is a possibility in the ethical framework only that those rights which are otherwise denied to many people, that by their own, it is possible that the ethical societies will pressurize or just use the appropriate ways of restoring those rights to those who have been dispossessed. But let us never abjure the path of moderation, which is very important for any proper objective to be achieved. You know, in Islam, it is not only the good objective, it is way. Allah says, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal mau'izatil hasana wajadiluhum billati hiya ahsan." Even when it is the best thing that you give call to the people, but it is very important the method you use. So you may have noble objectives, but you should just adopt the noble methods for achieving them. I hope, inshallah, if we think properly, and all of this is to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, situation will change, definitely change for the good. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
After that, we will have an open discussion. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Abbas Barzegar, who is an assistant professor of religion at Georgia State University in the United States and a term member of the Council of Foreign Relations, but is also currently a visiting researcher at Georgetown University in Washington. He received his PhD in 2010 from Emory University, specializing on the Sunni-Shiite conflict Islam in America and Transnational Political Islam. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, he's the co-author of Islamism, Contested Perspectives on Political Islam, published in 2009. His work has been supported by the Carter Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the British Council, the European Union, the US Institute of Peace, the Mellon Foundation, and the Georgia Humanities Council. At Georgia State University, he co-directs 2 interdisciplinary research projects, Civic Approaches to Conflict Resolution in the Muslim World, and After Malcolm, Islam and the Black Freedom Struggle. Dr. Abbas, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thank you for everybody for taking time to come and join us this evening. I'd like to speak to you and as well as read portions of my paper, and I'd like to begin by sort of just mapping out what the major problem is that I'm trying to tackle in this conversation, only a small portion of which I'll actually read. And it comes from what I believe forced displacement, the refugee crisis, if you will, the migration crisis, if you will, is exposing for us. What kind of real crisis is taking place? What has it shown us? For me, the forced displacement crisis has exposed a number of major vulnerabilities and fragilities in our contemporary moment, both in our own Muslim societies, as well as the society that I'm most familiar with, which is a Muslim minority context in a Western world where we have to deal with a number of issues. And so what are these fragilities? What are these problems that I believe exist? Well, the very drivers of the forced displacement crisis, and notice I use the term forced displacement because refugees are not just randomly refugees. They've been displaced and forced to be displaced by certain things. And the causes that drove that forced displacement are the weakest and most dangerous vulnerabilities that we have as Muslim societies. What are those? Those are authoritarianism in our society. Those are lack of democratic structures. Those are issues related to sectarianism, identity, and power in our own societies. And they actually relate very distinctly to the lack of applied Islamic ethics and practices within our own societies. So on one hand, in the origins of the refugee crisis, we have been exposed to the very problems, the core problems in our own societies. We've also been exposed through the migration map, if you will, and the transit maps, other vulnerabilities and fragilities in our societies, namely around economics, education, our own politics of identity and belonging. How is it possible that a country like Lebanon, that has so much experience dealing with Palestinian refugees, has not yet learned its lesson on how to treat people equitably, so that we have a seriously deteriorating situation of refugee management and care for Syrians who are displaced there? At the same time, even amongst refugees that are flowing through other countries like Jordan and Turkey, we have a problem understanding what their economic rights and roles and possibilities are. We have a problem just with what the nation state and community is within our own societies as hosts. And then finally, the impact that this has had on Western societies has exposed an even larger vulnerability for us, and that is exacerbating anti-Muslim bigotry on a global scale. So Western societies right now in Europe and North America have absolutely no problem blaming all of the world's problems on Muslim figures. And so we have this circular pattern taking place. And for me, this is absolutely overwhelming tidal wave. I believe that this is the challenge of our generation to tackle. And I have sought to do field work and investigate what kinds of practical solutions are available to us. I see, okay. What I've sought to explore through field work, through visiting these areas, what kind of practical solutions are available to us and are actually currently being implemented to help mitigate a number of these problems? How is it that these very issues are already being addressed by groups on the ground? And in order to explore that landscape, I've decided to focus in on what we could call the Muslim charity sector or the Muslim humanitarian sector. And for me, this ranges everywhere from local local mosque-based sort of networks, volunteer networks in a local context in a small town like Kilis on the border of Syria and Turkey, all the way to massive transnational NGOs like Islamic Relief, who has an operating budget of $500 million annually and operates in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. And my goal in all of this is to sort of map the NGO sector, if you will, the Muslim charity sector, in order to find practical solutions, case studies that can help answer some of these things. I firmly believe that the Muslim humanitarian sector, again, if you think about it broadly like this, is a social space that is not only understudied, that is, that we don't know as much as we should about this area, but it is also a space that can be radically optimized. It can be intervened, it can be strengthened, and the capacity can grow in such a way to help us answer some of these challenges. I believe that because up until now, we've tried just about everything else. Political parties, traditional, human rights, civil society type of organizations. We have a very robust media capacity in Muslim societies, both at state level as well as in private sphere and in the NGO space. But this space of the Muslim charity sector provides more than simply charity for us. It provides more than the opportunity to just offer aid and relief. Instead, it offers opportunities for professionalization amongst our youth. It provides opportunities for civic engagement with and integration with professional transnational organizations. It provides an access point into Western democracies, and I believe that this space deserves input, investment, and further recognition. So to map this is to also provide opportunities for growth and exploration. One of the areas that we can learn from in the Muslim charity sector, again, not only related to issues on how to provide aid and relief, and there's excellent work being done, but it is also to learn ethical lessons and theological lessons from the activities on the ground in these organizations. And what I mean by that is the following. In an environment, it is no secret, again, that sectarianism or sectarianization is plaguing our communities. In contexts where we have rampant violence against one another within a Muslim context, without a Muslim context, what we find is alongside these social spaces, a massive sector, a social space in the Muslim charity world that dissolves these differences. In practice, on the ground, you see issues of gender reform already being implemented. You see issues of tolerance and moderation amongst sectarian divisions and interpretive differences, that take place in the hallways of seminaries or online. We see those differences being mitigated on the ground in practice. So I believe that one of the most fruitful areas of mapping the NGO sector is to chart and graph and think about the emerging ethical norms and moral norms that exist in practice in this sector. My goal then, in the remainder of the paper, is to introduce you to just one of those elements I believe that sort of provides an ethical resource, and that is an emerging non-secular Islamic humanism. What I mean by that is that Western discourse grounds itself in a particular vision of the human being, and its approach to humanitarianism depends upon this humanistic Renaissance Enlightenment era model of the human being as sort of an organic, natural product. Classic Islamic humanism, over the last 100 years or so, has been something that's been debated quite a bit, but never really actualized in practice. I believe that the Muslim charity sector has sort of found and practiced, without conscious reflection, a type of practical, living fiqh of Islamic humanism and humanitarianism that emerges on the ground. And what I mean by this is, in the most simple way, is that a Muslim charity sector volunteer will not discriminate based upon sect, will not discriminate based upon nationality, and will not discriminate based upon faith and religious background. In the exact same context, if this was a political environment, we could expect that, let's say, Yazidis are not going to have full rights and citizenship in a Sharia-compliant sort of political vision. However, in the context of an aid and relief service, those Yazidis get just as much care as anybody else. The Kurdish refugees from northern Syria, and I understand that there are massive reservations to what I'm about to say, will receive many of the same benefits that others do in this context. Those conflicts are mitigated in practice. So I'd like to just simply read for you some of the strands of Islamic humanitarianist ethics that I have seen, and what we've done in seminar over the last 2 days, and what we'll continue to do tomorrow, is to think reflectively about what these resources can do for us and what these examples can do for us. I'll save you the sort of reflective piece on fiqh and urf that I've expanded, and you're welcome to read this paper when it comes out. But now I'd just like to narrate a little bit for you from what I've seen on the field. And Ray, please do keep me on track. How much time do I have?
You have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. I keep doing this. Okay. I start in the town of Kilis, located in southern Turkey, just 40 miles north of the war-ravaged metropolis of Aleppo. An otherwise forgotten stop on the ancient trading route, Kilis has now found itself at the center of the consequence of the geopolitics of indifference. The city of 90,000 has now swelled to just over 250,000 as countless displaced Syrians from all over the country flee their homes to find shelter, medical treatment, and sustainable life anywhere they can. Okay. Kilis, with its streams of humans in transit, miles of aid convoys, and overpopulated tent cities, provides a useful, if callous, space to think about politics as a game of flows. Over the course of the last 2 years, along with students and colleagues, I have explored the so-called Syrian refugee crisis, and in particular the role of religious development and aid agencies in mitigating the suffering of millions of displaced victims of the Syrian conflict. I refer to the refugee crisis as so-called, not in the sense that I don't consider it to be an actual crisis, but simply to draw attention to the convention of naming a human catastrophe such as this one. I take it as a moment of reflection that in the course of my research I have yet to hear a displaced Syrian refer to themselves as a refugee. Isn't it then our convenient naming of this phenomena of flowing bodies that I mentioned at the outset of this essay? Isn't it the case that basically we are labeling these individuals and robbing them of their actual identity to just simply manage them? In recent years, I have sought to better understand the ways in which the aid and development community aims to manage this indifference and how the victims of it themselves address it. After spending an afternoon with Mahmoud, a local man in his late 50s, who upon first glance, when you first see him, you would assume he is a day laborer in this city, I asked him about what kind of Islamic literature he read when he was younger. In asking, I was attempting to get a sense of the intellectual motivations that drove this man, who turned out to be a wealthy businessman, to dedicate the majority of his time and energy tending to the care of some 106 women and children whom he had housed in various locations in the city. These were properties actually that he just owned, and these were apartment homes that he turned into orphanages. He told me, counting the names off of his fingers, Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, Ayatollah Khomeini, Ali Shariati Maududi, and Muhammad Iqbal. They all had it right, he said. They all had it right, but we got it wrong. He said Maulana Rumi had the same idea 1,000 years before. He said, insan, insan, insan. Insan, or simply mankind, was a refrain that I heard continuously among aid and development workers. But to hear it in this formula has made me think more carefully about what my interlocutors meant when they talked about humanity, or humans. In one sentence, Mahmoud had managed to combine a vast and complex range of contemporary Islamic political thought and conclude that the aim of these projects was an essentially humanistic one. But the human here was not the human of the Western liberal secularist model, nor could I say that it was the human of some rarefied Islamic theological discourse, whether that's a classic discourse or a modern one. The humanitarian imperative for Mahmoud was as self-evident as it was universal. For Mahmoud, the rights of his guests were not grounded in any formal legal institution, fatwa, or charter. Rather, the rights and entitlements of those he cared for were simply ontological. I'll move later. I'll skip ahead. At IHH headquarters in Kilis, I was met by a number of volunteers who were with right cause deeply suspicious of my presence. I asked for an interview, and the group reluctantly accepted after my Turkish hosts insisted on my trustworthiness. I was given a 22-year-old volunteer who participated in daily deliveries to the Aleppo countryside. He had himself only recently arrived in Kilis from a small town north of Istanbul. I asked how he and his fellow aid workers managed to conduct their work inside Syria. My question had been a purely logistical one. I just wanted to know how he got access and got through the roads. He responded by looking deeply in my eyes, and he told me, "We have a paid staff of 500 people, a volunteer force of 5,000 that works harder than the staff, and every day we wake up with 70,000 orphans to feed." He recited a number of Quranic verses to me, and he did so with a voice of disdain that I would even ask such a question. Like Mahmoud, the young volunteer understood the work as a natural outgrowth of a self-evident Islamic humanitarian ethic. Later, I visited another agency, Denise Feneri, and I noticed, I'll read this one. The managing director of Denise Feneri was eager to express to our group of visitors over lunch that charity and stewardship were integral parts of his Turkish Islamic identity. He recounted the story of an Ottoman sultan, which one and when for him, of course, didn't matter, who spread bread crumbs and grain on the snowy hilltops of eastern Anatolian mountains in the dead of winter so that it could be said that even the birds were cared for under his dominion. The story is a reinvention of an earlier Islamic tale where the Umayyad Caliph Omar ibn Abdulaziz is said to have done this exact same thing. Today, there is actually a charitable organization that actually feeds birds in winter in the Kurdish regions of eastern Turkey. The repetition and reinvention of this Islamic tradition speaks volumes to the imagined community that is possible and that the aid workers continuously inhabit. I believe I should stop there just to go ahead and give us time for reflection. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Dina Taha, who is a PhD candidate in the sociology department at York University in Toronto. Dina holds a BA in political science from Cairo University and an MA in international human rights law from the American University in Cairo. She is the recipient of the Humanitarian Response Network of Canada Research Grant and the Ontario Graduate Scholarship of 2017. Her research interests focus on forced migration and gender, critical refugee studies, and post-colonial, anti-colonial studies and critiques. Her dissertation explores survival mechanisms of Syrian refugee women in Egypt, particularly through marriage to Egyptian nationals. She's got extensive experience with feminist and minority advocacy groups such as Nazra for Feminist Studies and Minority Rights Groups International. She is an active member at the Centre for Refugee Studies at York University. Dina, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this introduction, and thank you, of course, for inviting me. It's such a great pleasure to be here. The other thing that I wanted to commend is, first of all, the audience and the attendance, but also the parents, the moms and the dads who brought their kids to a public lecture. This is very impressive. We don't see that often in North American institutions, and please keep doing that. I just had to note that. So when I was invited to participate in this panel, of course, I was very thrilled because, first of all, the topic and the opportunity, but also as the only female panelist, which is always fun. And third, because when I had this opportunity back in the summer, emerge, I was just wrapping up my field work in Egypt, where I was interviewing Syrian refugee women, like Ray introduced in earlier about my project. Syrian refugee women who married Egyptian men, and I was looking into this aspect, like the marriage as a survival tool. And I just felt that there's so much going on that is not carried out by the media. And I was just looking forward to give those women an opportunity for their voice to be heard. And I'm not going to get into the details of my project, but during my interviews, a few of those women have obviously expressed ideas or like various social, economic, and legal reasons behind their marriage. And one particular, one interesting aspect or one interesting reason was what they refer to as sutra marriage. And by sutra, the man is basically motivated to marry particularly a widow or a divorced woman, like a single mom, that is especially that of another man who died at the war or was, she lost him in the war. And his intention, obviously, is to provide her and her children with livelihood and emotional support. This practice is justified and is arguably recurrent throughout Islamic history, where many have suggested it was encouraged in, like in the Islamic tradition as well as in the Quran and Sunnah. Since the theme of this lecture is on ethics and ethical dilemmas, I wanted to focus on an elusive notion that I'm still wrestling with up until now. So maybe this the conversation or the debate ignited here can help me get closer to it. The idea of victimhood, the notion of victimhood, and what does that mean, and what kind of implications it has on the person that we label as a victim, or even more specifically, a chronic victim. They can't escape the image of the victim. The portrayal of women refugees, particularly the refugee in general and the woman refugee in particular, whether by Western Orientalist cultures or within our own culture, is that she is a one-dimensional character with no agency, with no varied experiences, with no preferences. And this person or this character is often portrayed as a victim who needs to be saved. We all know by whom, by the man, of course. So what I chose to do here is by highlighting three cases, three of the women that I have interviewed who have they have mostly the same circumstances regarding marriage, and the three of them have used the notion of sutra, whether implicitly or explicitly. I just focused to shed some light on them and their experience. And my aim here is to put a face on this woman that we're talking about, this woman refugee victim. Victim between quotes, of course. So in doing that, my objective is to show how those women have different approaches and understanding to marriage to Egyptians, or marriage as a survival tool, and to sutra marriage in particular, and how their narratives often defy the victim image that is in our head. Again, whether, and I want to stress that, whether in the Western gaze, whether by the Western Orientalist cultures, or within our own culture, particularly within our jurisprudential texts, because I'm sure most of us have heard about the fatwas or the fatwas that came out to justify or motivate or regulate marriage to Syrian refugee women, and before them Bosnians and Chechens. So the women that I interviewed are, and forgive me because I tried to anonymize their names, but in my head I know their real names, so if I slip, just pretend that you haven't heard anything. So Maha, Mohra, and Nuran, those are three Syrian women who settled in the same city in Egypt after 2013, and the three of them have three marriages. Two of them are widows, and one of them is divorced, but they all have women, they all have children. And they have all referred to sutra marriage at some point. But despite all the commonalities between their profiles, the trajectory of their marriages, the results of their marriage, and their marriage experience is incredibly different. So just briefly to give an idea about the background of each woman, because I believe it's essential to treat each case individually, and that's what I meant by giving those women a face. So first, Mona, she is in her 40s. She grew up in Damascus in a well-off area. They refer to it as Shem, which is like an indication that it's like the prestigious area in Damascus, in Syria. When she got divorced, back in Syria, she refused to marry again for 11 years, and she justified that because men always requested for her to leave her children behind with her family, and she didn't want to do that to them. So for 11 years, she refrained from marrying again. However, as soon as she arrived to Egypt, like many other women, like many other Syrian women that I've spoken to, marriage proposals started to pour on her. When I asked her if she was actually considered seriously marrying any of those men, her response was affirmative, and she mostly focused on not social or economic support, but emotional support, as well as the social support. And she kept bringing examples about how a woman without a husband is like a tree without leaves, which is obviously a whole new lecture that needs to be discussed. But throughout the conversation with her, she reflected a conscious understanding of her position and the social restrictions that she has. She wasn't just like going with the flow, but also more importantly, she expressed that a sense of control of the situation, that she's also offering this man something in return. She's not just waiting to be saved. She's also offering something in return, and she kept talking about how marrying a Syrian is such a privilege, and the Syrian reputation, the Syrian woman reputation, and that she's going to spoil him and treat him well, etc. All I call it the stereotypical image of the Syrian wife. The second woman is Nuran, which is the youngest. She's 25 years old when I interviewed her last year. Her husband got killed in Damascus, and then when she moved to Egypt, just a few months in moving, she met her husband, and they got married in a religious ceremony only. And I'm referring here to Orfi marriage or customary marriage, which means that it's not registered in the government. And that's another issue that I'm happy to elaborate on later on. He left, but then 4 months after, throughout the marriage, he left her, particularly 4 months. And when I tried to dig in a little bit to understand the reasons, because she did not understand that, she admitted that he kept pushing to have a spousal relationship with her, and that happened once. And after that, his relationship with her started to drift away. Despite I haven't clarified that when they got married, it was what is referred to as kat biktab, which is just not the fact that they're not living together. They just he's legally allowed to see her without the scarf, but customary, they're not allowed to live together or have a full husband and wife relationship. The thing about Nuran is, despite her negative experience, she still justified her decision. She still stood by her decision, and in fact, she was also optimistic, and she was waiting for another opportunity to marry another Egyptian man. And again, it reflected a deep social awareness of her social restrictions and how she was able to identify her best options. Mohra is the oldest. She seemed to be more resourceful. She's Nuran's older sister, but she's so different because for Mohra, she actually worked. She was able to prove herself in Egypt, and before arriving, she has 2 kids. And despite going through the same context as her sister, and working and witnessing the satisfaction and the independence that comes out of the work, when her husband met her, he actually gave her the choice: would you like sutra, here referring to marriage, or consistent or monthly financial support? And she said, immediately, I picked sutra. That makes me wanna talk a little bit about the difference between vulnerability and victimhood. The trajectory of those women are, as we can tell, are different, and they vary based on the intention and the purpose of their marriage. In Mona's case, she and her husband needed the marriage for intimacy, and they were clear about this intention. And for them, sutra worked as a bonus for the real reason behind the marriage. For Nuran, marriage, sutra, and oblation and getting the religious reward was not enough, was not a good enough reason for the marriage to stick around. While Mohra, on the other hand, sutra was the glue that kept the marriage together. Her husband had a very clear image about why he's doing this, and he kept reminding her that he is doing it for the sake of her kids. So while the above shows the big role that the man plays in their stories, which is something that we can't really undermine living in patriarchal societies, not just in the Middle East or the Arab world or the Muslim world, but globally. The women also reflected a sense of control and making calculated decision, and that's what I wanted to highlight. In my work, or in this paper in particular, I wanted to highlight the resourcefulness of those women and their complex understanding of marriage as a survival mechanism. And this is why I wanted to focus on the underemphasized distinction between vulnerability and victimhood. While many of those women are in a clear vulnerable situation, whether because of their uprootedness or their forced migration status, as well as their gender and their economic precarity, the question of whether or not they're victims is it's the more complex question. The fact that, got it. So the social restrictions and the social structure that produced, what I'm trying to argue here is that while they are in a precarious situation and in a vulnerable situation, this vulnerability has actually offered them an opportunity, not just even putting the issue of victimhood on the side. This vulnerability was in fact an opportunity, a solution for them that is not available to other refugee populations, including refugee men and including other refugees in Egypt. And I'm not saying that this phenomenon only takes place in Egypt, but I don't like to generalize, I'm just focusing on Egypt. And in the Egyptian case, we have other refugees, whether they're Arabs or African, sub-Saharan African. So this opportunity showed itself with a little bit with Iraqis and before them with Bosnians, but it was more felt with the Syrian refugee women. So what I'm trying to say, let me say that in a different way. The vulnerable status and their social label as victim due to their refugeness and gender and ethnicity as Syrians, and their social position as widows or divorced women with children has provided them with an opportunity and a solution to their situation. And that complicates notions such as agency, autonomy, and victimhood. And it complicates it and it challenges the image in both the contemporary feminist and international humanitarian discourses, as well as the justifications that have been used by many of fatwas in the Islamic world. Let's back a little bit. That just not meant to undermine the patriarchal elements that have shaped those women's understanding of marriage and what kind of options are available for them within our patriarchal society. So I guess I can stop here. What I wanted to conclude with, and maybe we can leave that for discussion, I just wanted to throw it out there in case people want to talk about it a little bit more, are two things. First of all, how does this case study help us or help scholars who are focused on Islamic ethics? How does it contribute to that? I have a few suggestions, but I'm going to leave it for discussion. And the second question is that how can this case help us ask some fundamental questions about the meaning of Islamic ethics and revisiting notions such as manfa'a and darar and maqasid al-sharia. So I'm going to stop at that, and thank you so much for listening.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Taha Zaman, who is primarily interested in matters pertaining to refugee agency and alternative socio-cultural understandings of refuge during times of mass displacement. He was awarded a PhD in Refugee Studies from the University of East London in 2013. Using the perspectives from human geography and social anthropology, he explored the social and cultural life worlds of Iraqi refugees in Damascus. His PhD thesis was recently published as Islamic Traditions of Refuge in the Crises of Iraq and Syria. Dr. Taha has since worked extensively with a leading peace-building and conflict transformation NGO and is a member of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faiths and Local Communities, which is a platform for academics, policymakers, humanitarians and development practitioners working on conflict and displacement. His current research interest focuses on the intersections of forced migration, humanitarianism and social economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray, for the introduction. Hello, good evening, everyone. So the paper that I'm going to be presenting today is really a reflection on the past kind of 10 years of work that I've been doing around the intersections of religion and forced migration, looking at sites from Damascus in 2010-11, Antep and Urfa in Turkey in 2013, and Athens and Calais in 2016. Now, while carrying out research for my doctoral thesis on how religious tradition and praxis was mobilized by Iraqi refugees to negotiate experiences of exile in Damascus, I was struck by a note of cynicism participants sounded towards access to and the use of institutionally sanctioned religious spaces. Time and again, they drew attention to the ways in which the mosque seemed to be a residual echo of a place they had once known or imagined. They lamented the distant gaze of the mosque. It was neither a space for which they held a common responsibility to care and maintain, nor was it the hub from which news of kin, neighbors, and friends ebbed and flowed. The apparent indisposition and reluctance of the mosque to engage directly with the challenges faced by refugees in Damascus in 2010-11 was itself a direct corollary of the Assad regime's attempts to assert control over the production of religious knowledge and bodies. This translated into what was perceived as near indifference on the part of institutional religious actors to the plight of Iraqi refugees. As one participant succinctly put it, the only thing we ever hear from the mosque is the call to prayer. The nurturing of a relational self or an Islamic ethic was instead forced to seek out and forge alternative home-like spaces, producing a distinct geography of both exile and the sacred. So what do we mean by religion if we are to open up our investigation beyond these institutionally sanctioned interpretations of religion? That is to say, how useful is the notion of sacred space if we are to extract religion from its supposedly proper places? If social space is produced and begins with bodies in relation to one another, then we must accept that spaces of religion are overlapping, coexistent, in parallel with other spaces, internally in tension, and being made up of multiple contested, real and imagined sites and relations. Religious traditions, as an ongoing argument extended through time, allow us to move beyond the meta-narrative of a nation state and find much needed space to begin thinking differently. The understanding of these arguments are ongoing means they remain unresolved and open. The future is not the past repeated. We now live in a world where mobility stratifies and is a material mark of difference between people. For displaced people standing at the threshold of a sedentarist world created by the discourses and practices of a nation state, religious traditions provide a powerful vernacular and idiom that allows them to create a past for themselves, which will legitimate them in a way which just being themselves in the present will not allow them to do. For writers such as Talal Asad, readings of what constitutes Islamic tradition and practice must be understood on its own terms. It cannot be disentangled or disembodied from the living practices of historically and socially located communities and their institutions. It is a discursive tradition wherein each successive generation confronts its particular problems via an engagement with a set of ongoing arguments. Thinking of ways in which traditions are susceptible to recalibration and reassembling, rather than simply a continuity of well-rehearsed beliefs and practices, holds open the distinct possibilities of tradition to transform and move in new directions. A brief survey of refugee populations across the world today reveals that mass displacement crises are perhaps this generation's particular problem. More than half, 53% of the 14.4 million refugees registered with UNHCR, and this doesn't include people who are not registered with UNHCR, come from 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. The number similarly excludes the 5.1 million Palestinians who are displaced, and similarly, Muslim majority countries account for 4 of the top 5 countries that are hosting refugees. For displaced people, spaces of religion coincide with humanitarian spaces, as Abbas pointed out. Narratives and symbols of both religion and humanitarianism are used to code and decode the encounter with the unexpected arrival of a stranger in need. Both these fields, however, are heavily shaped and structured by the nation state. Through its mastery and accumulation of symbolic capital, the nation state has been able to set the rules of a game, conferring legitimacy on particular actors and producing spaces of exception that allow it to manage the encounter between citizen and the other. This does not mean that displaced people are completely passive when confronted with the securitized humanitarian gaze of the state and institutional actors. My work with Iraqi refugees in Syria confirmed that religion as a space of representation and as a social cultural resource is recalibrated, reimagined, and reinvigorated to counter the exclusionary boundary-making practices and discourses of the nation state. In so doing, displacement-affected people engage in acts of crossing and dwelling, that is to say, crossing boundaries, borders, and making homes that have been described by the cultural geographer Thomas Tweed as the fundamental concerns of religion. However, it's quite clear that our ability to make homes and cross boundaries is not equal. Mobility is subject to what Doreen Massey calls power geometry. Some people have a greater command over mobility than others, and in fact use that command to exclude others. So for displaced people, the act of crossing the border and attempts to make home are often challenged in the process of seeking refuge. The failure of the availability of the so-called durable solutions advocated by UNHCR, return, resettlement, and local integration, points the forced migrant into a life of liminality, betwixt and between the interstices of the nation-state system. Such situations, and it's worth remembering here, and this is possibly where I may have to kind of disagree with Abbas and say humanitarianism is not where the struggle really lies, is that these situations are protracted in nature, lasting on average 17 years. Through a broadly consistent refusal to grant refugees the right to work, governments ensure the responsibility to provide welfare for refugees falls squarely on the shoulders of international organizations. Refugees come to regard local integration as a dim prospect, buttressing the logic of the host state, which opposes integration in favor of creating a more vulnerable refugee population that is able to induce greater financial resources from the international community to share the cost of hosting the refugees. It also marks the refugees as recipients of aid that the local population is often not entitled to. Entitlements bestowed through the auspices of state were a point of contention between marginalized communities on the peripheries of Baghdad. The bureaucratic labeling of Palestinians as guests by the state was adopted in public discourse in Iraq. A popular Arabic proverb has it that the stranger should be well-mannered. Ya gharib kun adib. Likewise, Palestinians in Iraq were expected to know their place and show gratitude for the hospitality shown to them rather than challenge the stratification that placed them below the status of citizen. One of my participants, let's call her Fatima, a 40-year-old housewife from Mosul, told me, Whenever there would be a problem between us and our neighbors or someone, they'd remind us that we are Palestinians living in Iraq. They'd say things like, "Anta nazil wa dabju ala sath." You're a guest and you dance on my roof. It's an old Iraqi proverb that means you think you're better than us. You don't even have respect for your hosts. Top-down interventions to manage populations by the state in this way do little to nurture practices of neighborliness. Negotiating the encounter with difference is done so from a distance, produced by the nation state, that exacerbate feelings of suspicion and mistrust. Shared histories and collective memories of earlier migrations remain, however. In the camps of southern Damascus, kinship ties had already existed, not only with Palestinian Iraqis that had fled Iraq in the earlier phase of the crisis, back in 2010, but with relatives that had settled in Damascus following the Nakba of 1948. Here's Fatima again, this time relating her experience of being a refugee in Syria. Dealings with Palestinian Syrians are good. They've supported us, and I don't feel like a foreigner around them. This is a Muslim Arab country, so I don't have the sense of ghurba, exile and alienation. It's only that my wider family is far from me that I feel like that I'm far away from home. There are so many similarities here with our lives in Iraq, food, language. Yes, there are some differences, but it's not great. I feel like that we're all Palestinians together here. Now, Fatima immediately associates the largely positive interactions she has with Palestinian Syrians with not feeling foreign. Linking the two is the fact that she is in a Muslim Arab country, and as such has an understanding of how social relations are structured and mediated. However, one cannot ignore that she refers exclusively to Palestinian Syrians rather than Syrian society at large. Access to the city was limited. Palestinian Syrians in Damascus were largely concentrated in camps such as Mukhaym al-Yarmouk. For other forcibly displaced from Iraq, the sense of ghurba was more tangible. This is particularly the case for men who are expected to be breadwinners in their households. The liminal space that refugees occupy, the ambivalent position of the state towards Iraqi refugees generally, designating them as guests, and the issuing of fixed-term residency statuses of 3 to 2 months added to this sense of ghurba. This feeling of alienation may not initially stem from relations with the host population, but rather the bureaucracy of the state and the surrogate state that marks them as other, which in turn creates a distinction for the host population. Here, Abu Yassin, a 50-year-old school teacher from Iraq, recognizes the effect this has on refugee and host community relations, narrating fears of an uncertain future. He told me, "It affects you at the level of a people and not the state. People get to know that this house is not a Syrian or Palestinian Syrian house, so social interaction isn't entirely harmonious. Some people like Iraqis. I get on well with my neighbors, but how do they deal with you? You're not an Ibn al-Balad. Up until now, I consider myself a guest, a visitor, here temporarily and then leaving. I don't have any expectation of permanent residence." For Abu Yassin, it's the state that produces this anxiety, creating alienation. Ambivalence in the language that the state employs with respect to Iraqi refugees. At one and the same time, they are shaqiq and they are dayuf, which points to a more temporal state. Oscillating between two categories of refugees and host communities struggle to balance the unconditional hospitality. Yet the interventions of the state and the humanitarian agencies transform refugees into guests constrained by the limits of hospitality. By affirming only negative rights and deflecting the burden of welfare responsibility onto international humanitarian organizations and agencies, the Syrian government, in tandem with UNHCR and UNRWA, established a parallel system of protection that in fact marks refugees as others. Nonetheless, the refugee cuts an ambivalent figure in Islamic tradition, standing in for a wide array of characters from students, traders, ascetic dervishes, pilgrims, and forced migrants. While exile for the stranger may be accompanied by poverty, the response towards the stranger from those who are in place is often welcoming. Ahlan wa sahlan, an oft-heard expression in the Arabic-speaking world, is more than simply a welcoming phrase. As Al-Ghazali observed, it is the sound of awkwardness and barriers being removed, a welcome that finds room in the heart and in the place. Literally, it's an invitation for someone to be at ease as if they were amongst their family. The word Sahel, it should be noted, is also in reference to fertile plains to be contrasted with the inhospitable terrain of a desert dominating the landscape of the Arabian Peninsula. Good treatment of strangers was thus a highly regarded custom of pre-Islamic Arabian culture, such that those who demonstrated kindness and generosity to strangers were lauded with the title of Ma'wa al-Gharib, refuge of a stranger. This favorable disposition towards the stranger was further institutionalized by Quranic and prophetic injunctions, which encouraged generosity and good conduct towards strangers. Notions of karam, or hospitality and generosity, remain integral to Arab and wider Islamic culture. In everyday relations, in the urban context of Middle East, are able to maintain dignity or karama as they negotiate the experience of exile. Hospitality accounts for little if there is no dignity. Refugee-led community development responses are integral to opening up spaces for everyday neighborly interactions. My participants continually alluded to the spaces that they themselves created, community spaces, which were home-like spaces where the idea of a relational self was able to be nurtured and practiced. So the use of metaphors of home and mother to describe these community spaces is significant and telling. It casts lights on how embedded such organizations are in the lives of refugees. These home-like spaces emphasize relational aspects of home, wherein protection and security is found within ties of fictive and actual kinship rather than with international NGOs and agencies. They're not only spaces in which material resources are accessed, but familiar, welcoming places wherein refugees are recognized as being more than just a case number. They are quotidian, everyday spaces, rather than spaces that are explicitly labeled as religious, in which the potential, and this is important, in which the potential to facilitate and maintain relations with both guest and host communities is nurtured. They are convivial spaces where recognition as well as contestation and conflict can take place. Iraqi, Palestinian, Syrian, Sudanese refugees I've worked with over the past 10 years have all established self-help initiatives, rhizomatically connected to transnational networks of self-reliance. From the security of these home-like spaces, opportunities emerge for the refugee to be both host and neighbor. I'll conclude this presentation with a quote from a Syrian refugee who I met in Urfa, who echoed exilic experiences of Iraqi and Palestinian refugees, signaling the salience of neighborly visits as a barometer of meaningful relationship. And it is here that the Ummah and the Watan is located, in these local and everyday spaces. He told me, I like it when they, the Turks, treat us equally and not as poor refugees. When they visit and invite us in their homes, I feel normal and equal to them. I'm not made to feel like a refugee. It's great when people call on this. Visiting people's homes like this means we have proper relations. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Muhammad. I would like to direct my question to Dr. Abbas, particularly if humanitarian organizations start to go into different, can say, fields or have different objectives. Wouldn't this limit their mobility to function in certain societies? Particularly if you see in like social organizations or in Egypt and how they were banned, many organizations are banned in different places if they have other goals or objectives. Thank you.
Sari Hanafi, American University of Beirut. I mean, four talks are really fascinating, but I will have one question to Abbas also. I'm so enjoying reading and listening to you twice during these 2 days. I will comment on what you told us. A human, I quote you, here was clearly not the human of Western liberal secularism, nor could I say that it was the human of some rarefied Islamic theological vision. So the humanitarian imperative of Mahmoud was as self-evident as it was universal. Okay. And then you extend saying it's not grounded in a formal legal institution. So I have two questions. First, I think you put it in a quite excessive way. You may say they are inspired by different set of of uh, of a notion of humanitarian instead of, but it's not that, it's not that. This is take it as a suggestion. I need your comment on. And second, I'm wondering if we don't take Habermas' notion, how he conceptualizes human rights, by considering human rights as not a moral imperative, but rather it's judicial innovations. It means that through judicial system, slowly, we establish what now is called a set of or Universal Declaration of Human Rights and things like that. So maybe why don't you use the category judicial to mediate between this abstract universalism stem from rationality, enlightenment, or context, or something coming from religion like Islam and contextualize, etc. I mean, I'm thinking loudly. I mean, yeah, okay.
Hello, thank you all for your presentations. My name is Paulino Robles Gil. I'm from the Contemporary Muslim Thought and Societies program from HOME, College of Islamic Studies. September last year, there was a big earthquake in Mexico City. And the way the people reacted, erasing social classes, erasing many boundaries that usually are present in the society, was the best outcome of the earthquake. People were surprised how come the emergency have brought society together, something unthinkable before. Why does the Ummah have to wait until a catastrophical condition or an emergency, a state of exception, to erase boundaries and to realize that the Ummah is one and to think of the Muslim community as one body? Isn't it a weakness already? I mean, thinking about this sectarian issue, you were mentioning that how these conditions of refugees and the Muslim humanitarianism is doing like a living thing and erasing differences, is actually becoming an anti-sectarian kind of tool. So the question is, why does the Ummah have to wait until a state of exception to realize these things? And second, how much does that ethical behavior last? I mean, once they see on the ground that differences sometimes are absurd or sometimes should not take place, how does that last? Is that enduring? Is that lasting? Does it have a positive long-term effect? So, in other words, a catastrophe can be beneficial in terms of bounding a society or a community in the long term.
I'll start it. I'll go in reverse order. I was in Kuwait a few years ago. It happened to be right around the same day of my birthday that an ISIS suicide bomber blew himself up during a Shiite at a Shiite mosque, right? And what was amazing about that was obviously it was a terrible disaster, state of exception, but the norm revealed itself as very resilient. At that moment, Kuwaiti national society is very anti-sectarian, right? And very quickly, the images on social media, national media, and it was supported by the Emir himself. God bless him for doing this. He visited the mosque himself, and it sent the message of unity and anti-sectarianism there. And in that context, what we saw wasn't a state of exception. It was actually the norm that pushed back against sectarianization. And what I'm suggesting is that it's our job as thought leaders and as institution builders to actually meet that norm. There is an emerging norm out there, but it unfortunately is not, it is not given the tools to augment and strengthen itself against the institutions that are pathological in our society. So when I talk about ethical mapping, what I'm asking is that we give strength and meet the emergent norms that are exemplary already in place. And so I would say that, yeah, it's a disaster, obviously, that we have to wait until times of crisis to see this. But there are some societies where this resilience is already in place, and it's our job as thinkers and scholars to map those out and amplify those voices so that the pathological, voices are drowned out when they happen. And we've seen this repeatedly. I mean, even in, excuse me for speaking so freely, but even in this current crisis, you've seen a major discord between the social responses to the Gulf crisis and the political responses. And that's been something, fascinating to see across the Gulf. I'll take that to answer Sari's question about sort of my problematization of the human as such. And when I talk about the human in Mahmoud, for example, for him, the human and human right was ontological, self-evident, universal. Actually, what I think I'm doing, Tahir, is I'll concede to Tahir here, is that there are certain moments of authentic relational self-building. I don't know what we would call it to agree upon, but there are certain moments on the ground that are happening that I think reveal themselves as absolutely sovereign for that moment. They don't require a kind of reflection. They don't require a sort of theological justification. They're happening, they're commonsensical.
You call them universals.
Well,
This is what
well, the reason they're universal is because the people that are acting upon them consider them to be universal. They consider those rights to be absolutely divinely mandated, universal, sovereign, inviolable, and they're emerging from this common space of human action. That human action, that ethic, deserves attention, it deserves our reflection, and it deserves that we respond to it. So even problematizing the category of human in a different way for me is a bit too violent. I want to sort of provide a space where we're meeting the challenge set forth by actors on the ground. And because of that, I would say that the human and the human right that could be sort of problematized either through Habermasian or other categories, I'm hesitant to do it in some ways. Only because I stop at a certain point, and I don't know enough about it. I don't know how that would go about, but I do think that the more data, so to speak, or the more force we have from the ground up, it will force our institutions to change and conform to the realities on the ground. And I think our role as scholars may be to empower that. And finally, just on a quick note, the trend already in the international humanitarian organizations, mainly of faith-based ones, and some that have exemplary moral political force, such as Doctors Without Borders, the pattern already is that the business of aid and development, the business of aid and relief is seen as supporting some of the worst forces of state oppression. And so many of the humanitarian organizations that I think are worth emulating have already moved into advocacy, they've already moved into research, they've already moved into media and social commentary, they've actually created structures of finance and resource mobilization that challenge conventional norms. And so it is the case that many of them will get in trouble, like IHH gets in quite a bit of trouble, both with the Turkish state, with international organizations. They lose, they get people killed by Israel or by ISIS. But these organizations, again, I believe this social space is one worthy of exploring further. So thank you.
Sorry, I do want to kind of like speak back to Abbas just a little bit, and that's to think about, the way in which humanitarian interventions themselves, in the context of conflict-induced displacement, right? So when we talk about conflict-induced displacement, we're talking about displacement, as I said earlier, last around 17 years on average. These are protracted sort of situations. And the kind of humanitarian relief assistance kind of model just doesn't work. And granted, there are moves towards more sort of multi-mandated approaches where, development approaches are part and parcel of what these organizations do. But for me, I think they disrupt. And I say that they disrupt because the relationship between those who are already in place and those who newly arrive becomes skewed through the interventions of the humanitarian organizations. The humanitarian organizations provide much needed relief and assistance, which does away with that hospitality role of those who are already in place. And I think that's, Catherine Brunn has written quite extensively on this, but I think that's really important to kind of bear in mind, that we don't overemphasize the humanitarian responses to displacement, because I think the encounter of the encounter that arises through displacement is a possibility and a potential for that, what we're talking about in terms of Islamic ethics, and that's disrupted in a sense, through this. And let's face it, humanitarianism is part and parcel of broader agendas around containment and part of more neoliberalizing agendas as well. So those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, so my question is for the whole panel. I'm Ahmed Magdi, I'm part of the general audience. And my question is, from my basic knowledge, I don't see where the clear line is, or why is there a clear line between what we call Islamic ethics and just ethics? So just a general question for your comments on it.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Syed Shams. I'm a strategy consultant by the profession and a social philanthropy by the nature. I've got a basic questions and one specific question though. My basic questions are, when does the recognition of a refugee takes place? And how does the refugee crisis occurs? Then when does the refugee crisis occurs, how does the UN defines a particular individual as a refugee? And one specific question to Abdul Majid Khan Sahab. In the case of a refugee crisis that happened with the Rohingya, we have seen the lots of mess that happened around the world. Definitely there is a lot of big words that you intellectuals spoke about, displacement, disruption, and it had happened, and it's a part and parcel of the refugee crisis for the sure. So when it happens, instead of seeing that perspective as the humanitarian crisis at a large scale, why does some countries connote that particular issue as the territorial issue, specifically in two aspects, and they label them as the antisocial and they label them as the terrorists? How do we perceive? As an individual, I am outrageous to that kind of an aspect of the assumption or the fact, and I want an intellect opinion about this perspective from you all experts. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hayat Duhan from Doha Institute. So I have a question for Dina. So you talked in your presentation about marriage as you call it as a survival tool or sutra. So I would like to know how you define this concept and whether you have dealt with it as an Islamic concept or as a more cultural concept. And the second question is that since these Syrian refugees have came from Syria to Egypt, which are, patriarchal societies, I would like to know how the patriarchal nature of these societies have kind of increased the victimization, or what you call the victimhood of these women. Thank you.
Dr. Abdul Majid Khan started the presentation by asking about responsibility and the ethical role, etc. So 6 countries nowadays in the GCC, all of them prohibit the entering of refugees and providing them aid except through the state. So how can the citizens in the GCC, which is a non-democratic council and cannot change rights and cannot demand a change in rights, so what is their duty when they have no authority or ability to take decisions or make decisions? The question now about marrying Syrian women, do you see it as an ethical marriage? Because there's exploitation of some sort that has taken place. Marrying a woman from the GCC is expensive, so now there's an exploitation by marrying those refugee women because it's less costly and it's easier. Even if it were a solution for a Syrian woman, the Syrian lady is taking a decision out of being vulnerable to begin with.
Just very briefly, I mean, in terms of UNHCR, it's two major ways. One is individual refugee status determination interviews, where the asylum seeker should provide evidence of persecution or fear of persecution. The other way, which very recently the UNHCR have acknowledged more formally, is the idea of prima facie refugee status, where there is a massive problem like the Syrians, very, very large scale, and so they don't go through individual interviews, but rather all Syrians basically who flee their country are considered to be refugees. That doesn't take into account the internally displaced, but that's the UNHCR's mandate, is to determine a refugee from an asylum seeker through these procedures.
So I start with the question which was first asked about Rohingya Muslims. Most Rohingya people, actually we live in a world where since 9/11, Muslims, Islam, this whole legacy has been we have been put in a dock. For something we had in history, people were talking of the sectarian tendencies and can we transcend them. I just use a formulation, I will repeat it here. It is that whatever in the Muslim Ummah, there was some things that I just speak, that I say that there have been some fault lines in history. But there are people in present times who are making use of these fault lines to have a particular agenda and to see that there is fratricidal war among Muslims and they are making use of it. Similarly, as the people who have an idea of Zionism, suppose, they understand it that if there is nothing, they have to create one. That there is, the people have to do something to show that we are right and the rest of the people are wrong. So there, these countries which have been very negative attitude, they have demonstrated very openly about Rohingya Muslims. Unfortunately, in one way or the other, they too have been, their whole polity, they have been based on this to target the Muslims. And you must know that Rohingya, they belong to the other country, within the countries, in the name of terrorism, war on terror, Muslims are being targeted in many countries, and so they have been the countries who said, okay, no to Rohingya Muslims. And that image of being, some people get the political power because of it, oh, we are the people who can fight them. They are the troublemakers, and so their constituency is further reinforced by taking a stand which is against all human norms. This is about Rohingya Muslims. About GCC countries, I know what you say the moral imperatives are. The first point is, if the entry is, they don't allow the people to come in the country, but don't they make any contribution to see that their problems, crises are addressed. If the countries do it, then I am not, there is something else demanded for giving some suggestion, but I can just say, let the people in these countries, GCC countries, let them contribute to this, that the problem is lessened, of those who give the refuge, give them the help, give them the support. There are many forms of giving the support if you are unable to give them the space. This is my suggestion.
Okay, so I don't want us to forget the question that was asked at the beginning about the difference between Islamic ethics and ethics in general, but like my background is in sociology. This is not my area, but I'm interested in seeing your responses. Sorry, I'm just putting you on the spot. The questions regarding sutra marriage, I believe there is some overlapping between the two questions, so I'm going to try to answer collectively. The first question about how did I treat sutra marriage, whether as an Islamic notion or a cultural notion. First of all, I would just like to clarify that I'm separating the notion of survival from sutra. Sutra is one understanding of survival mechanisms to marriage. And I think your question about whether it's an Islamic or a cultural concept is very important, and it's actually the essence of the question. In my paper particularly, I focus more on it as an Islamic notion, but that is really hard to separate from the culture and how we understand support and aid and tarahum, etc. Those notions, which brings me to your second point about patriarchy, because unfortunately it intertwines heavily with our religious understandings and our religious interpretations, and even within the jurisprudential culture. And by jurisprudence, I am referring to fiqh or jurisprudence as a human product. This we cannot separate this product from social influences and social factors, including patriarchy. And this is one of the major critiques to contemporary jurisprudence and even like classic jurisprudence. Patriarchy, how did patriarchy contribute to victimhood, to those women's victimhood? So let me back up one step and clarify that even though I was focused in my presentation on how those women are trying to defy the victimhood status and how they are not necessarily victims all the time, even if they're vulnerable, it does not mean that she is a victim all the time and in all cases, and that when one of them was given the option to between financial support and marriage, she still chose marriage for other reasons than economic, yes, such as social, to avoid harassment, for example. Which brings me to the third question that I was asked, and I'm just going to translate it first because I did not translate it and it was asked in Arabic. So the question was asking about my moral and ethical evaluation of sutra marriage, or marriage for the purpose of sutra or sheltering. And where does the exploitation lie within this assessment, since those women are are asked to make this decision from a weakness, like a position of weakness, which is, I completely agree with you, and I thank you so much for asking that question. That's a very essential question. But let me start by clarifying that I am a sociologist, so my role as an academic is not to assess, or at least I chose in this particular case not to assess this case ethically, because it has been done by media a lot. Like people, like media and people have been speaking on behalf of those women all the time to assess whether or not they should, it's ethical or not. But I still think it's a valid point, and it needs to be debated. And this is how the society gets to define and redefine its ethical standards and its moral stances. But the point from me talking about, so I'm not going to answer the question of whether or not I think it's ethical or not, because obviously the quick answer or the obvious answer is that it depends. from one case to the other, and that there has been instances where women have been terribly exploited, and they were even lured from outside Syria into Egypt to just to find out that their husband is incredibly in a dire economic and social situation. So there has been instances of exploitation. But my point from bringing up this issue, the issue of sutra marriage, and tackling it from kind of the positive aspect of it, and how women are not as weak or fragile or as victims or passive that we think, is that what I'm trying to do is to contribute to challenging the stereotypical image of the woman, of the refugee woman and the Muslim woman as a victim, and try to give more layers to her personality, to her character, that she's more than that. And maybe I'm hoping that that would contribute to how we interpret how we come up with our fatwas, our jurisprudence, and how we view the woman. So yeah, sorry for the long answer, but those are very rich questions, and thank you so much for them.
I was just going to respond to the question on Islamic ethics versus ethics, and for me, it's just a question of are you starting? Is your point of departure the autonomous self and care of the self in Foucault's terms, or is it a question of a relational self? And if it's a question of a relational self, then I don't see Islamic ethics being very much different from a Catholic ethics or a Lebanese ethics, a Judaic ethics. It's because those traditions are more concerned with the ideas that the self is not wholly autonomous. The self exists because the other is present.
I'm not sure who goes first. Whoa, that's loud. My name is Justin Burkett. I'm actually visiting from the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary in Canada. My question is directed to the professor from York University in Toronto, Ms. Taha. I just wanted to, and the lady behind me asked the question as well, I was just hoping that you could elaborate on the notion of marriage as a survival mechanism, and how these refugee women, you sort of touched on this notion of how refugee women use their vulnerable status, if you will, as an opportunity, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And this notion of Syrian women marrying as a survival mechanism, is it present in other nations outside Egypt? I know the focus of your research is targeted in Egypt. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And wonderful conversation from all the panelists tonight. Thank you.
السلام عليكم. عادل خالدي من معهد الدوحة. سأحاول الخلط في الأسئلة إلى حد ما. السؤال الأول موجه إلى دينا. According to Denise Candioti and her research about patriarchy bargain, the women are always less value than man. In Sub-Sahara, her position is better because she owned land, but in Middle East, her value determined by her if she is young or if her family, الحسب والنسب is the wealth of her family. So nowadays the research are focusing in other character, like if the woman is educated or working. So my question is about the Syrian woman. What are the characteristics determined her value? This is the first question. My second question is about how this is affect the Egyptian society, or to focus on the Egyptian woman, how it focuses the Egyptian woman, and is it to competition, or I don't know. This is my second question. So, yeah. السؤال الثاني موجه إلى الدكتور Abbas. You are talking about Islamic humanitarian work. I want to put draw land تحت Islamic. Is it include in international NGOs, or it's Islamic humanitarian? If we are saying it's another thing, it's Islamic humanitarian work, I think there are many problematic issues. The first one is about fund. What we are talking about fund, the international NGO ask that they need to show the fund where from coming. من أين لهم الفund? But in Islam there is الحديث الذي يقول أنه لما تقدم المال لا تعلم اليد اليسرى ما قدمته اليد الأمنى فالصفة تبقى دائما مجهولة. الممولون يفضلون ألا يفضحوا عن هويتهم. هذا يتعارض مع شروط الأنجيو العالمية. يعني هذا الخلط كيف يتم حله؟ شكرا.
Okay, thank you very much for your panel. I'm Hifzi Malais. I'm an entrepreneur and I'm very interested in humanitarian action and humanitarian work. So I came to this panel for just to have one answer for my question. And it is, for me, I always look for problems to solve as an entrepreneur. So like, I need, like, if anybody can help me from all of you, what could be like an innovative project for problems like for the refugees or the humanitarian, because I'm out of the field. I live in Qatar here for 12 years. If you just can help me, I'll be very thankful. Thank you. My major is policy planning and development. I'm from Qatar University, but yeah, and I have some background about humanitarian work and entrepreneurship.
More importantly, how much money have you got?
Yeah, that's the hardest part, yeah.
Hi, my name is Kelly. I teach at one of the international schools here in Doha. My question is, I guess, to all of you. How does the humanitarian aid go in and separate that us and them feeling, right? You talked about the relationships and that sense of protection and pride and the economy giving back to the place you go to and being grateful. How do the humanitarian efforts go in and foster that as opposed to make it the us versus them or put everyone in big camps?
In a way, everybody on the panel talked about the Islamic morality at the individual or the community level. Right? I just wonder what would you suggest or have in mind, considering that state has a big role to affect a large amount of population, and being responsible also to cause them. But yeah, from to the political leadership.
And one of the things is, like, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about humanitarianism? Are we talking about an architecture? Are we talking about an infrastructure, the built environment metaphors? Is it a system? Or is it a business? Is it a market? Right? So if we think of it as a market, the humanitarian economy is actually smaller than global pet food economy. That's how much money goes into humanity. So pet food and chewing gum is bigger than humanitarianism, right? Secondly, remittances play a very powerful role, but sometimes don't get captured into the official humanitarian picture. The point about humanitarianism also, the official formal humanitarian system is, and this is a point which is captured by displaced people often. You know, I have a friend who runs a community center in Istanbul. He's Palestinian Syrian, and he describes NGOs as vampires. He said they suck our blood. They're here to suck our blood. They get paid great amounts of money, and what that's actually pointing to is an awareness on the part of displaced people that an economy emerges because of their tragedy, the crisis that they are in. A whole economy emerges, right? And the displaced person is simply an end user in that economic chain, right? Blankets are provided, food baskets are provided, medicine is provided, and so on, for fixed periods of time. And then the circus moves on, right? So the question about if we are to understand humanitarianism as an economy, is then to think about, well, how can that economy be reconfigured to make the displaced And I wouldn't even say displaced person. I'd say displacement affected communities, because it includes also the people who receive displaced people. How can we make them integral actors in that economy? And that's what really needs to be considered, because the current system doesn't do that. There's a very interesting report that I've just been involved in with the Overseas Development Institute, talking about reimagining humanitarianism, which, so I'm giving a little plug here, which is being released in two parts. One part is the overall report, which is this month, and the next part is specific contributions in the following month. But the idea is really because the humanitarian system, to all extents and purposes, is broken.
The question that you brought up about funding and identity is one that many donors feel a problem with. So many people have a problem donating to larger Muslim NGOs because they have to register their identity. But it's something that is constantly being mitigated, and it is something that now we're seeing, they're distrustful for the most part of big NGOs all the time. I mean, this is just a pattern. Most people want to give to smaller local ones. So there's sort of a tension there, but the big Muslim NGOs have seriously gotten over this issue. They comply with the same standards internationally and nationally that they need to, and their constituent base, especially amongst the younger generation, if those organizations can provide transparency to both the donor and to the government, many people feel safer doing this, because now, you can go to jail, and if you're in Europe or the United States or the UK, and you donate to an organization that, that is irresponsible, you can be falsely accused of supporting a terrorist organization, and this can destroy you as an individual. I mean, there's an American man who's in jail right now in America. He's a total American white guy for buying gift cards and donating them to a particular agency, and it was a complete setup. So many people like these structures that are in place, but there's obviously an issue there. On the feeling of community and humanitarianism, many projects are being accelerated on the ground. I agree fully with Tahir's assessment of and pessimism of the sector as a whole, and many of my own interlocutors, I didn't hear the word vampire, but I heard similar stories, but many of the faith-based NGOs especially, not just Muslim ones, but Christian ones as well, are doing innovative things to accelerate local solutions, economic solutions to displacement, post-war and post-conflict, kind of economic transformation. You're seeing this in certain agricultural sectors. I know a group in Chicago, a church-based group in Chicago, that has taught Syrian women who are displaced in Iraq to produce soap, like high-quality herbal, bath soaps, and they're producing their funding out of this, and they're shipping these soaps, and they're being distributed amongst local markets in the United States. So these are opportunities where these economic solutions can provide empowerment and whatnot, and I think those are the kind of projects that need to be scaled. About solutions. FinTech, financial technology, provides opportunities to work on providing displaced populations across borders access to remittances easier than we would in a traditional setting. So right now, a major problem is just getting cash to displaced peoples. So financial technology solutions that subvert the traditional banking system that already exist, that's a good space, including cryptocurrencies. This is a space I think that is ripe for entrepreneurial intervention. Another space is modular digital education, because this is one of the biggest challenges, is the protracted nature of the displacement crisis creates educational problems, and we lose whole generations because of this. So there are opportunities now to provide basic education, and we're not talking about just knowledge, but life skills also that can be developed through digital technology solutions, and to make better use of certain existing structures. And then also in the medical field, surgery and prosthetics. Okay, surgical tools, prosthetics, and sort of mobile surgical solutions. So there are some groups out there that are developing kind of a surgery room in the back of a container that can be shipped, that can be moved around. We can get doctors to the field, but if the field doesn't have the kind of tools necessary, we can't provide the surgical solutions. And even things like diabetic management and preventative care management through, again, digital technology. So I think digital technology provides a number of possible solutions that really only entrepreneurs can fix. And so I'd be happy to talk to you about it more.
My fellow panelists, they have been working with a lot of NGOs and they have done their lot of field work, so they're in a better position to guide those who want. But I have just very small two observations. One is that there is a need for introspection for these NGO systems, how do they operate, and whether this issue, what you have been telling, that sense of belonging and dignity of the persons, I have just a small suggestion for that the people who take refuge in any place or who have a problem, the people who are out of those problems, who are the first recipients of those people, they are to be ethically sensitized. And if they offer some solution, that should have a precedence and priority over others who come from outside the field. Because many times I have just witnessed it. Suppose I am from a place A and there is a problem at place A. If I am not sensitized about the problem, somebody comes from place Z, which is far away. So I think maybe he has some special interest in helping somebody in place A. So my sensitivity that gets dull. And I tell you one of the sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he said that the best of the families is one who some orphan is in the family, some orphan. So that is somebody becomes mother, somebody becomes father and brother. And I have seen in my childhood a boy who had lost his father and mother, and believe me, he was just an integral part of the family. Now he leads, they took care of him, his education and all that. So natural solution, if I can use this term, natural solution should be encouraged, where those individuals, now just see, they're individuals. I told you in the beginning that in this Islamic scheme, your ethical considerations, they emerge from your religious consciousness. And for that, there is somebody who oversees you. That is your Lord. And you just take it. It is something which can deliver me in the hereafter. So your sense of doing things and you restrain your negative temptations while you may just try to abjure the responsibility. So you have a different framework, and for that, if I can just say, maybe more natural solutions should be seen. Maybe I cannot just say that these humanitarian organizations are irrelevant or they should be disbanded. I don't say like that. But I want to say that let that separate and that to take care of the people who want to do things and make them sensitive to the issues. Maybe they too will play their part. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. I'm going to try to address them quickly given the time limit. So the first question about elaborating more about on marriage as a survival tool or as an opportunity. So I'm going to respond to that by just briefly quoting a piece, like an excerpt from one of the interviews that I conducted with Nuran, the 25-year-old woman whose husband abandoned her 4 months after knowing her. So in that context, I was asking her about why would she accept getting married as a second wife, because most of those marriages are polygamous. They're usually second wives. Marriage is, or if you're a customary, which means that it's not registered in the government, and they're discreet, are secret in secret as well. So I asked her, so you mean you don't care if you are a first or a second wife as long as your daughter is with you? And she responds, yes, dear, excuse me, but for women like us, we don't think about ourselves, we think about our children. When you buy anything for the house, do you think of yourself or your son? And I reply, in my country, I had my rights. I was able to manage. Here I am in a strange country. Why would I work and humiliate myself? Meet this and meet that, the good and the bad. No, I apply sutra to myself and my daughter and find a human being who is honest and straightforward and offers me a decent life. I'm not saying that I want a car or a big house, middle ground, a decent life. So if you notice here, she's her status as a woman who's in need of help and support as a single mom, that gave her an opportunity, a solution out of her situation, out of her economic and social issues through marriage. And this is what I meant by marriage as an opportunity, and how vulnerability in that case, on the flip side of this vulnerable and labeled victim status, she was actually able to find a solution to her situation, which is not available to other refugees, whether they're Syrian, whether they're men, whether they're like other racialized refugees. So that's the answer to the opportunity question. The second question about whether it exists outside of Egypt, of course, it took place in many other Arab, I'm not sure of other Muslim countries, maybe in Turkey, but I don't have the data to back that up. All I can tell you is that there have been reports in countries such as Lebanon and Jordan, and even Saudi. One of the women that I have interviewed, she was married to a Saudi man before she married her Egyptian husband, and he's the one who brought her to Egypt, using the same rhetoric of like applying sutra on her or supporting her. The question about why Syrians, and I don't think I can answer that question in like a minute or two, because that's my whole dissertation. But what I can tell you is that there are layers to answering that question. The most obvious reasons are what is covered in media, that Syrian women are cheaper to marry, they're better looking, they have like more Caucasian features, and that's something that is appreciated in cultures such as the Egyptian one. It's more exotic. They are better cooks. They listen to their husbands more, which is a dissertation on itself. Because like, yeah, Egyptian women apparently, and that was hesitantly mentioned to me a couple of times by Syrian women, and given that I'm Egyptian and that I'm obviously not, that don't have the Caucasian factors, there was like some awkward moments about how we're kind of better looking than you guys, we have like lighter skin, we cook better, we even smell better. So there have been some awkward conversations. So as you can tell, going back to your second question about the reaction of Egyptian women, and as you can tell, there's a big room, big space for rivalry and competition, and like how people started exaggerating that this is creating what's called the spinster situation, that Egyptian women can't find husbands. But I think that's an exaggeration given the number of Syrians in the country. I think the real rivalry or the real issue is with the first wife, because again, most of those marriages are polygamous. Yeah, so that's the concern regarding the reaction. So obviously, it's been dramatic, the relationship between Syrian and Egyptian wives. I think that's it. I'm just touching base quickly on ground solutions. I don't think my answer is going to satisfy you because I'm coming from a theoretical background, but my work in this paper is focused on providing sociological insights to jurists, scholars that are working on Islamic jurisprudence, and how we can incorporate a sociological aspect into the fatwas, and understanding the reality of the people that we're issuing fatwas to. So basically, how to incorporate a gendered perspective, a gendered fatwa, how to come up with a fatwa that is sensitive to gender rules and power relations. So I guess the short answer is invest in think tanks, in research centers. It does not fit the neoliberal profit model, but long term, it's like a human investment, I guess. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I need to bring the session to a close. I want to thank you very much for your participation and excellent questions and a terrific debate. If you could please join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions.